I have done 30 plus certifications and am here to guide you throughout your certification journey. In this video, we will be covering some important questions of the Microsoft AZ-104 exam. You can find the complete PDF of this video and our practice questions through the link down in the description. To the important questions. Question 1. Your company has a Microsoft Azure subscription. The company has data centers in Los Angeles and New York. You are configuring the two data centers as geo-clustered sites for site resiliency. You need to recommend an Azure storage redundancy option. You have the following data storage requirements. Data must be stored on multiple nodes. Data must be stored on nodes in separate geographic location. Data can be read from the secondary location as well as from the primary location. Which of the following Azure stored redundancy options should you recommend? Here in this question, based on the given requirements, we should recommend read-only geo-redundant storage. Thus, the correct option is B. RAGRS allows you to have higher read availability for your storage account by providing read-only access to the data replicated to the secondary location. Once you enable this feature, the secondary location may be used to achieve higher availability in the event the data is not available in the primary region. This is an opt-in feature which requires the storage account to be geo-replicated. Question 2. Your company has three virtual machines that are included in an availability set. You try to resize one of the virtual machines which returns an allocation failure message. It is imperative that the VM is resized. Which of the following actions should you take? Here in this question, we receive an allocation failure message when trying to resize one of the three virtual machines. As such, we should stop all three virtual machines. Thus, the correct option is C. If the VM you wish to resize is part of an availability set, then you must stop all VMs in the availability set before changing the size of any VM in the availability set. The reason all VMs in the availability set must be stopped before performing the resize operation to a size that requires different hardware is that all running virtual machines in the availability set must be using the same physical hardware cluster. Therefore, if a change of physical hardware cluster is required to change the virtual machine size, then all virtual machines must be first stopped and then restarted one by one to a different physical hardware cluster. Question 3. You have an Azure virtual machine that has a single data disk. You have been tasked with attaching this data disk to another virtual machine. You need to make sure that your strategy allows you for the virtual machines to be offline for the least amount of time possible. Which of the following is the action you should take first? Here in this question, we need to ensure that our strategy allows for the virtual machines to be offline for the least amount of time possible. As such, we should first detach the data disk. Thus, the correct option is C. You can simply detach a data disk from one virtual machine and attach it to the other virtual machine without stopping either of the virtual machines. Question 4. Your company has an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a number of Azure virtual machines using Azure Resource Manager template. You have been informed that the virtual machines will be included in a single availability set. You are required to make sure that the ARM template you configure allows for as many virtual machines as possible to remain accessible in the event of fabric failure or maintenance. Which of the following is the value that you should configure for platform fault domain count property? Here in this question, based on the given scenario, the value that we should configure for the platform fault domain count property is max value. Thus, the correct option is D. The number of fault domains for managed availability sets varies by region, either 2 or 3 per region. Question 5. Your company has an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a number of Azure virtual machines using Azure Resource Manager templates. You have been informed that the virtual machines will be included in a single availability set. You are required to make sure that the ARM template you configure allows for as many virtual machines as possible to remain accessible in the event of fabric failure or maintenance. Which of the following is the value that you should configure for the platform update domain count property? Here in this question, based on the given scenario, the value that we should configure for the platform update domain count property is 20. Thus, the correct option is B. Each virtual machine in your availability set is assigned an update domain and a fault domain by the underlying Azure platform. For a given availability set, 5 non-user configurable update domains are assigned by default to indicate groups of virtual machines and underlying physical hardware that can be rebooted at the same time. Question 6. Your company has an Azure AD tenant that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises Active Directory domain. The on-premises virtual environment consists of virtual machines running on Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper vhost servers. You have created some PowerShell scripts to automate the configuration of newly created virtual machines. You plan to create several new virtual machines. You need a solution that ensures the scripts are run on the new virtual machines. Which of the following is the best solution? Here in this question, we need to ensure that the scripts are run on the new virtual machines. As such, we should configure a setup complete.cmd batch file in the percentage win directory percentage slash setup slash scripts directory. Thus, the correct option is A. After you deploy a virtual machine, you typically need to make some changes before it is ready to use. This is something you can do manually, or you could use remote PowerShell to automate the configuration of your virtual machine after deployment, for example. But now there is a third alternative available allowing you to customize your virtual machine, the custom script extension. This custom script extension is executed by the virtual machine agent and it is very straightforward. You specify which files it needs to download from your storage account and which file it needs to execute. You can even specify arguments that need to be passed to the script. The only requirement is that you execute a .ps1 file. Question 7. Your company has an Azure AD tenant that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises Active Directory domain. You plan to deploy several new virtual machines in Azure. The VMs will have the same operating system and custom software requirements. You configure a reference VM in the on-premises virtual environment. You then generalize the VM, create an image. You need to upload the image to Azure to ensure that it is available for selection when you create the new Azure virtual machines. Which PowerShell CMDlets should you use? Here in this question, based on the given requirements, the PowerShell CMDlet that we should use is add-az-vhd. Thus, the correct option is B. The add-az-vhd CMDlet uploads on-premises virtual hard disks in .vhd file format to a blob storage account as fixed virtual hard disks. Question 8. Your company has virtual machines hosted in Microsoft Azure. The VMs are located in a single Azure virtual network named VNet1. The company has users that work remotely. The remote workers require access to the virtual machines on VNet1. You need to provide access for the remote workers. What should you do? Here in this question, we need to provide access for the remote workers. As such, we should configure a point to site VPN. Thus, the correct option is C. A point to site VPN gateway connection lets you create a secure connection to your virtual network from an individual client computer. Question 9. Your company has an Azure AD subscription. You need to deploy 5 virtual machines to your company's virtual network subnet. The VMs will each have both a public and private IP address. Inbound and outbound security rules for all of these virtual machines must be identical. Which of the following is the least amount of network interfaces needed for this configuration? Here in this question, we need to deploy 5 virtual machines to our company's virtual network subnet. They will both have a public and private IP address, and inbound and outbound security rules for all of these VMs must be identical. Based on this, the least amount of network interfaces needed for this configuration is 5. Thus, the correct option is A. 5 virtual machines, so 5 NIC cards. We have public and private IP address set to them. However, they need same inbound and outbound rule, so create NSG and attach to NIC, and this requirement can be fulfilled 5 NIC, hence 5 is the right answer. Question 10. Your company's Azure subscription includes Azure virtual machines that run Windows Server 2016. One of the virtual machines is backed up every day using Azure Backup Instant Restore. When the VM becomes infected with data encrypting ransomware, you decide to recover the VM's files. Which of the following is true in this scenario? Here in this question, the statement that is true in this scenario is that you can recover the files to any virtual machine within the company's subscription. Thus, the correct option is B. You can restore files by mounting the backup to your own local machine if you like, just like you could on any of the virtual machines in Azure, as they are all 2016. It just uses an ISCSI connection to the backup image. You cannot restore files to an older or newer version of the OS. It must be compatible client OS. Therefore, restoring files back to the same subscription is the best option, but it has to be the same OS version. Although answer A is possible, but restoring files back to an infected virtual machine does not sound right to me. Question 11. You Administer a solution in Azure that is currently having performance issues. You need to find the cause of the performance issues pertaining to metrics on the Azure infrastructure. Which of the following is the tool you should use? Here in this question, we need to find the cause of the performance issues pertaining to metrics on the Azure infrastructure. As such, we should use Azure Monitor. Thus, the correct option is B. Metrics in Azure Monitor are stored in a time series database which is optimized for analyzing time-stamped data. This makes metrics particularly suited for alerting and fast detection of issues. Question 12. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a recovery services vault. You want to use Azure Backup to schedule a backup of your company's virtual machines to the recovery services vault. Which of the following virtual machines can you backup? Choose all that apply. Here in this question, the virtual machines that we can backup are VMs that run Windows 10, VMs that run Windows Server 2012 or higher, VMs that have not been shut down, VMs that run Debian 8.2 plus, and VMs that have been shut down. Thus, the correct options are A, B, C, D, and E. Azure Backup supports backup of 64-bit Windows Server operating system from Windows Server 2008. Azure Backup supports backup of 64-bit Windows 10 operating system. Azure Backup supports backup of 64-bit Debian operating system from Debian 7.9 plus. Azure Backup supports backup of virtual machine that are shut down or offline. Question 13. You have an Azure AD tenant that contains 5,000 user accounts. You create a new user account named admin user 1. You need to assign the user administrator administrative role to admin user 1. What should you do? From the user account properties. Here in this question, we need to assign the user administrator administrative role to admin user 1. As such, we should, from the directory role blade, modify the directory role. Thus, the correct option is B. Assign a role to a user. Sign in to the Azure portal with an account that is a global admin or privileged role admin for the directory. Select Azure Active Directory, select users, and then select a specific user from the list. For the selected user, select directory role, select add role, and then pick the appropriate admin roles from the directory role list, such as conditional access administrator. Press select to save. Question 14. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 and an on premises deployment of Microsoft System Center Service Manager. Subscription 1 contains a virtual machine named VM1. You need to ensure that an alert is set in Service Manager when the amount of available memory on VM1 is below 10%. What should you do first? Here in this question, we need to ensure that an alert is set in Service Manager when the amount of available memory on VM1 is below 10%. As such, we will first deploy the IT Service Management Connector. Thus, the correct option is C. The IT Service Management Connector allows you to connect Azure and a supported IT Service Management product or service, such as the Microsoft System Center Service Manager. With ITSMC, you can create work items in ITSM tool based on your Azure alerts. Question 15. You have an Azure AD tenant named contosocloud.onmicrosoft.com. Your company has public DNS zone for contoso.com. You add contoso.com as a custom domain name to Azure AD. You need to ensure that Azure can verify the domain name. Which type of DNS record should you create? Here in this question, we need to ensure that Azure can verify the domain name. As such, the type of DNS record that we should create is a MX. Thus, the correct option is A. To verify your custom domain name, sign into the Azure portal using a global administrator account for the directory. Select Azure AD and then select custom domain names. On the Fabricam dash custom domain names page, select the custom domain name Contoso. On the Contoso page, select verify to make sure your custom domain is properly registered and is valid for Azure AD. Use either the TXT or the MX record type. There are several versions of this question in the exam. The question can have two correct answers, MEX or TXT. The question can also have other incorrect answer options, including the following SRV and NSEC3. Question 16. You have an Azure subscription. You have 100 Azure virtual machines. You need to quickly identify underutilized virtual machines that can have their service tier changed to a less expensive offering. Which blade should you use? Here in this question, we need to quickly identify underutilized virtual machines that can have their service tier changed to a less expensive offering. As such, we should use Advisor Blade. Thus, the correct option is B. Advisor helps you optimize and reduce your overall Azure spend by identifying idle and underutilized resources. You can get cost recommendations from the cost tab on the Advisor dashboard. Question 17. You have an Azure subscription linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant. The tenant includes a user account named user1. You need to ensure that user1 can assign a policy to the tenant root management group. What should you do? Here in this question, based on the given requirements, we should assign the global administrator role to user1 and then instruct user1 to configure access management for Azure resources. Thus, the correct option is C. No one is given default access to the root management group. Azure AD global administrators are the only users that can elevate themselves to gain access. Once they have access to the root management group, the global administrator can assign any Azure role to other users to manage it. Question 18. You have an Azure subscription that contains a user named user1. You need to ensure that user1 can deploy virtual machines and manage virtual networks. The solution must use the principle of least privilege. Which role based access control role should you assign to user1? Here in this question, we need to ensure that user 1 can deploy virtual machines and manage virtual networks while using the principle of least privilege. As such, we should assign the contributor role to user 1. Thus, the correct option is C. Contributor grants full access to manage all resources but does not allow you to assign roles in Azure RBAC. Question 19. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 that contains an Azure virtual machine named VM1. VM1 is in a resource group named RG1. VM1 runs services that will be used to deploy resources to RG1. You need to ensure that a service running on VM1 can manage the resources in RG1 by using the identity of VM1. What should you do first? Here in this question, we need to ensure that a service running on virtual machine 1 can manage the resources in RG1 by using the identity of virtual machine 1. As such, we should, from the Azure portal, modify the managed identity settings of VM1. Thus, the correct option is A. Managed identities for Azure resources provides Azure services with an automatically managed identity in Azure AD. You can use this identity to authenticate to any service that supports Azure AD authentication without having credentials in your code. You can enable and disable the system assigned managed identity for VM using the Azure portal. Question 20. You have an Azure DNS zone named adatum.com. You need to delegate a subdomain named research.adatum.com to a different DNS server in Azure. What should you do? Here in this question, we need to delegate a subdomain named research.adatum.com to a different DNS server in Azure. As such, we should create an NS record named research in the adatum.com zone. Thus, the correct option is A. Question 21. You have a registered DNS domain named contoso.com. You create a public Azure DNS zone named contoso.com. You need to ensure that records created in the contoso.com zone are resolvable from the internet. What should you do? Here in this question, in order to meet the given requirements, we should modify the NS records in the DNS domain registrar. Thus, the correct option is D. Registrar owns the TLD and will have their NS registered against the domain by default. By changing the registrar NS records to point to your Azure DNS NS records, you take ownership into your Azure DNS. Question 22. You have three offices and an Azure subscription that contains an Azure AD tenant. You need to grant user management permissions to a local administrator in each office. What should you use? Here in this question, we need to grant user management permissions to a local administrator in each office. As such, we should use administrative units. Thus, the correct option is B. Administrative units restrict permissions in a role to any portion of your organization that you define. You could, for example, use administrative units to delegate the help desk administrator role to regional support specialists so they can manage users only in the region that they support. Question 23. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account named Storage 1. The Storage 1 account contains a file share named Share 1. The subscription is linked to a hybrid Azure AD tenant that contains a security group named Group 1. You need to grant Group 1 the storage file data SMB share elevated contributor role for Share 1. What should you do first? Here in this question, we need to grant Group 1 the storage file data SMB share elevated contributor role for Share 1. As such, We should first enable Active Directory Domain Services authentication for storage 1. Thus, the correct option is A. Before you enable Azure AD over SMB for Azure file shares, make sure you have completed the following prerequisites. First, select or create an Azure AD tenant. Second, to support authentication with Azure AD credentials, you must enable Azure AD domain services for your Azure AD tenant, etc. Note: the storage file data SMB share elevated contributor allows read, write, delete, and modify NTFS permissions in Azure storage file share over SMB. Question 24. You have an Azure App Services web app named App1. You plan to deploy App1 by using Web Deploy. You need to ensure that the developers of App1 can use their Azure AD credentials to deploy content to App1. The solution must use the principle of least privilege. What should you do? Here in this question, we need to ensure that the developers of App 1 can use their Azure AD credentials to deploy content to App 1 while using the principle of least privilege. As such, we should assign the website contributor role to the developers. Thus, the correct option is C. To secure app deployment from a local computer, Azure App Service supports two types of credentials for local Git deployment and FTP/S deployment. These credentials are not the same as your Azure subscription credentials. Question 25. You have an Azure subscription that contains 10 virtual machines, a key vault named Vault 1, and a network security group named NSG1. All the resources are deployed to the East US Azure region. The virtual machines are protected by using NSG1. NSG1 is configured to block all outbound traffic to the internet. You need to ensure that the virtual machines can access Vault 1. The solution must use the principle of least privilege and minimize administrative effort. What should you configure as the destination of the outbound security role for NSG1? Here in this question, we need to ensure that the virtual machines can access Vault 1 while using the principle of least privilege and minimizing administrative effort. As such, we should configure a service tag as the destination of the outbound security role for NSG1. Thus, the correct option is B. In order to ensure that the virtual machines can access Vault 1 while also using the principle of least privilege and minimizing administrative effort, you should configure a service tag as the destination of the outbound security role for an SG1. Service tags represent a group of IP addresses associated with Azure Platform as a Service and Software as a Service services. By specifying a service tag as the destination of the outbound security rule, you can allow the virtual machine to access Vault 1 without having to manually specify the IP addresses of Vault 1. This reduces administrative effort and ensures that the virtual machines are only able to access Vault 1 rather than any other internet destination. Question 26. You plan to use the Azure import/export service to copy files to a storage account. Which two files should you create before you prepare the drives for the import job? Here in this question, the two files that we should create before preparing the drive for the import job is a dataset CSV file and a drive set CSV file. Thus, the correct options are B and E. Modify the dataset.csv file in the root folder where the tool resides. Depending on whether you want to import a file or a folder or both, Add entries in the dataset.csv file. Modify the driveset.csv file in the root folder where the tool resides. Question 27. You have a recovery service vault that you use to test backups. The test backups contain two protected virtual machines. You need to delete the recovery services vault. What should you do first? Here in this question, we need to delete the recovery services vault. As such, we should first, from the recovery service vault, stop the backup of each backup item. Thus, the correct option is D. You cannot delete a recovery services vault if it is registered to a server and holds backup data. If you try to delete the vault but cannot, the vault is still configured to receive backup data. Remove vault dependencies and delete vault. In the Vault dashboard menu, scroll down to the Protected Item section and click Backup Items. In this menu, you can stop and delete Azure file servers, SQL servers in Azure VM, and Azure virtual machines. Question 28. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. You have 5 TB of data that you need to transfer to Subscription 1. You plan to use an Azure import/export job. What can you use as the destination of the imported data? Here in this question, we can use Azure File Storage as the destination of the imported data. Thus, the correct option is C. Azure import/export service is used to securely import large amounts of data to Azure Blob Storage and Azure Files by shipping disk drives to an Azure data center. The maximum size of an Azure Files resource of a file share is 5 TB. Question 29. You have an Azure storage account named Storage 1. You plan to use AZ copy to copy data to Storage 1. You need to identify the storage services in Storage 1 to which you can copy the data. Which storage services should you identify? Here in this question, the storage services that we should identify are blob and file only. Thus, the correct option is B. AZCopy is a command line utility that you can use to copy blobs or files to or from a storage account. Question 30. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure storage account. You plan to create an Azure container instance named Container 1 that will use a Docker image named Image 1. Image 1 contains a Microsoft SQL Server instance that requires persistent storage. You need to configure a storage service for Container 1. What should you use? Here in this question, we need to configure a storage service for Container 1. As such, we should use Azure Files. Thus, the correct option is A. To retrieve and persist state with the Azure Container instances, we offer direct mounting of Azure File Share backed by Azure Storage. These were all the questions for this video. You can find the complete PDF of this video and our practice questions through the link down in the description. We will be publishing more parts to this series in the future, so please make sure to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.